Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 101. Not the heir, but the spare. We finally left the reign of Antiochus III behind. So, we begin a new reign with his son, Seleucus IV. However, we haven't really had a lot of background on our new king. So today, let's examine who exactly this new monarch is and introduce his rule. Back in episode 84, we listed the controversies surrounding the children of Antiochus III and when they were born. We said that Seleucus IV was born in 218 BCE. As such, when he becomes king in 187, he is already 39 years of age. Seleucus was the second son of Antiochus III and his cousin Laodicea III. He had, by our count, an older brother and an older sister. 3 years before he was born, his father and mother had welcomed their first child, Antiochus the Young King. 2 years later, so 1 year before Seleucus IV was born, Seleucus's elder sister Laodicea was born. There were also other children, including a Prince Mithridates and a possible Prince Ardys, but we won't get into them today. Skipping over a few decades, Seleucus IV was sent west in 196 BCE to act as his father's commander in Lysimachia. He was given instructions to rebuild the palace in the area, which may have been intended to act as a residence for the young prince. As we discussed in episodes 84 and 85, the same year in 196, Antiochus the Young King and Laodicea the Younger would marry. The couple were 25 and 23 years old. As such, the then Prince Seleucus was 22 years old when his brother married his sister. However, the union would not last that long. Antiochus the Young King died in either 193 or 192 BCE, and I believe we may have gone with 193 BCE when we covered it. Seleucus was 25 years old when his older brother died, and his older sister became a widow after just 3 or so years as a married woman. It is the death of Antiochus the Young King that catapulted Seleucus into the limelight. Before, he had been the spare, the second son who may not have been expected to rule. However, just like Antiochus II, Antiochus III himself, and Henry VIII of England, the second-born son was now first in line for the throne. This is where the story gets a bit icky and brings us into new territory. Seleucus didn't just inherit the position of his older brother as crown prince, he also inherited his marriage. At some unspecified date, Seleucus IV also married his sister Laodicea, who we can now safely call Laodicea IV. This was at the instigation of their father Antiochus III, so I'm guessing it wasn't long after Antiochus the Young King had died. I can imagine that the thought was going through the old king's head that Antiochus the Young King had not had a son of his own before he died, and the family line needed to be secured, but that's just speculation. We know the wedding happened sometime before 187 BCE, as Seleucus IV and Laodicea IV succeeded jointly as king and queen. However, it would have happened after either 193 or 192 BCE, as Antiochus the Young King needs to be dead for this wedding to occur. If there's no information that I'm missing, I can imagine it might have happened at about 188 or 187 when Antiochus III set out for the east and left his son in charge. That way, he may have ensured a smoother transfer of power and the possibility of the next generation arriving as he set out for the east. However, that's pure speculation based on what seems reasonable, the timing of their children's births, and the idea that Antiochus III would have been focused on dynastic security given how precarious his own position was when he came to power as the last remaining Seleucid. If anyone has any more information, feel free to contact me. Let's get on to the topic of these children. Laodike had already had a daughter called Nyssa by her first brother husband. By her second, she now had more children. Their first son was Demetrius, born in 185 BCE after his grandfather had already died and his father had become king. This was when his father was 27 years old. Their second son, born 5 years later in 180 BCE, was called Antiochus. Their third child was called Laodike, let's call her Laodike V, and a birth date is not given for her. Now, in 180 BCE, when Antiochus was born, Laodike IV would have been 39, so it seems likely that Laodike V was born before this and not after, given reproductive ages. For the sake of argument, I'll put down 183 as the possible year of Laodike V's birth. This fits nicely with the broad idea of a 2-year gap, which has been cited in papers in terms of gaps between pregnancies and lower risk of side effects. I won't go into it here, but I talked about it in more detail in episode 115 of Biopedia if you want more information. So, that's the family filled out. Seleucus IV has 3 children: Demetrius, Laodike V, and Antiochus. Now, it's noteworthy, at least to me, that the eldest son is not called Seleucus or Antiochus. Moreover, Demetrius has historically been an Antigonid name rather than a Seleucid one. Demetrius I of Macedon, way back in the early days of the podcast, had been the father of Stratonike, wife first to Seleucus I and then to Antiochus I. This means that Demetrius I would be the 4th great-grandfather of this new Prince Demetrius. Who knows, maybe Seleucus IV wanted to use this Macedonian name to highlight his connection to the West in order to recover some of the prestige lost after Magnesia. Alternatively, maybe he was trying to channel some of the energy of his father in saying that he had a claim to the West and that the Western provinces weren't a closed book yet. However, once again, that is just speculation. Let's finish off the rest of the reign of Antiochus III from his son's perspective. Seleucus IV served in the Seleucid forces during his father's war with Rome. He popped up a few times in our story, trying to take a Greek city here, besieging Prince Attalus of Pergamon there. He was, crucially, present at the Battle of Magnesia where his father was defeated. His cousin Antipater then agreed to the peace terms in Rome, which confined his father's empire east of the Taurus Mountains. A few years later, Seleucus was elevated to the throne as a co-ruler based in Antioch, while his father went off east to try and reclaim power and rebuild his fragmenting empire. It was while ruling in Antioch that Seleucus received news that his father had died, and thus that he was now sole king. That's where we'll leave off for today, with Seleucus IV having just assumed power. It's a bit of a shorter one today, but we will resume next time with a look at the Mediterranean that Seleucus IV inherited, and start off his reign. Until then, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch with the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week everyone.